There is a moment, just before nightfall, when the world grows still and listens. The light turns amber through the trees, and the leaves, those ancient witnesses, catch the dying sun like stained glass in a forest cathedral. Perhaps you have felt it, that hush that falls when you speak of fortune too loudly, that instinct that makes your hand reach, almost of its own accord, for the nearest wooden surface. Knock, knock, knock. The sound is small, almost apologetic. 3 gentle raps upon a tabletop, a door frame, a banister worn smooth by 1,000 palms before yours. And with each tap, something shifts in the air around you. Something old, something patient, something that has been waiting since the first forest covered the earth. Why do we do this? Why, in an age of reason and light, do so many of us still reach for wood when we speak of luck or fear, of hope or dread? What ancient knowing lives in our fingertips? Come, settle in. Let the evening gather around us like a cloak. Tonight, we shall wander through the twilight of memory and belief, through sacred groves and children's games, through synagogue doors knocked in secret, and the great ash tree that holds the universe together. For the old ones knew something we have half forgotten, that wood remembers, that trees listen, and that sometimes the simplest gesture carries the weight of 1,000 years. But before that, comment down below which country you are watching from. In the ancient forests of what we now call Europe, great oaks rose from the earth like the pillars of heaven itself. Their canopies spread so wide that entire villages could shelter beneath a single tree, and their roots ran so deep that people believed they touched the very bones of the world. The Celtic peoples who wandered these green cathedrals did not see trees as we see them today, as timber, as resources, as pleasant scenery for an afternoon walk. No, to them, each tree was a doorway, a vessel, a breathing presence that bridged the gap between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. The Druids, those mysterious keepers of ancient wisdom, chose groves of oak trees for their most sacred ceremonies. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, described how these white-robed priests would climb into the branches of sacred oaks on the 6th day of the moon, cutting mistletoe with golden sickles and catching it in white cloth before it could touch the ground. They believed that nothing growing from an oak tree could be anything less than a gift from heaven itself, and that to touch the wood, to make contact with its ancient spirit, was to commune with powers far older than human memory. But it was not only the Druids who felt this. Throughout the Celtic world, from the misty shores of Ireland to the dense forests of Gaul, ordinary people approached trees with a reverence bordering on awe. In Ireland, the early alphabet itself, the Ogham script, assigned each letter to a specific tree. The oak was door, a word so similar to the Irish word for God that scholars have long wondered whether the Celts believed they were literally descended from trees, sprung like fruit from divine branches. The Irish bile, or sacred tree, stood at the heart of tribal life. These great sentinel trees marked the center of each kingdom, and to harm one was considered among the gravest of crimes. Some say the guardian trees of Ireland grew from seeds given by visitors from the other world, that strange, shimmering realm that existed just beyond the veil of ordinary sight. When the wind moved through their leaves, it was said that messages passed between this world and the next, whispers from ancestors long departed, advice from spirits yet to be born. Consider what this meant for those who lived beneath these canopies. When you walked through a forest, you walked through a congregation of gods. When you needed protection, you did not pray to some distant deity in the sky. You went to the oak at the crossroads, placed your palm against its rough bark, and felt the thrum of ancient power beneath your fingertips. When good fortune came your way, you offered thanks not to the air, but to the living wood that had witnessed your blessing. It is believed that in those times, when someone spoke of their luck, when they boasted of a good harvest or a healthy child, when they dared to name their fortune aloud, they would reach for the nearest tree and knock upon it, calling the attention of the spirits within. The first knock was to wake the sleeping gods. The second was to ask for their continued protection. And the third was an offering of gratitude, a reminder that the speaker had not forgotten the ancient covenant between humans and trees. Some say the knocking served a different purpose, that by making noise against the wood, one could prevent malevolent spirits from overhearing words of good fortune. For the old ones knew that luck was a fragile thing, easily envied and easily stolen. Speaking of blessings too loudly was like leaving gold coins in the open road. Evil spirits and jealous fae were always listening, always waiting for a chance to snatch happiness away. The hollow sound of knuckles on wood, they believed, created a kind of protective static, a sacred interference that scrambled the words before they could reach wicked ears. The Germanic peoples of Northern Europe held similar beliefs, though their trees were the mighty ash rather than the oak. In their cosmology, a great ash tree called Yggdrasil stood at the center of all existence, a cosmic pillar whose 3 enormous roots reached down to 3 wells of power, and whose branches stretched up to hold the 9 worlds of gods, humans, giants, and the dead. This was not merely a symbol. To the Norse and their kin, Yggdrasil was as real as the ground beneath their feet, and every ash tree in the forest was a reflection of that divine original. The god Odin himself had hung upon Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear in order to gain the secret wisdom of the runes. The tree was his gallows and his teacher. To touch wood, then, was to touch the very thing that had given knowledge to the gods, to align oneself with the cosmic order, to participate, however briefly, in the great mystery of fate and fortune that the 3 Norns wove at Yggdrasil's roots. Those 3 Norns, Urdur, Verdandi, and Skuld, were among the most powerful beings in all of Norse mythology. They tended the world tree daily, watering its roots from the well of fate and shaping the destinies of gods and mortals alike. Some scholars have suggested that the act of knocking on wood was originally an appeal to these 3 sisters, a way of asking them to weave one's fate kindly, to strengthen the threads of fortune, rather than cut them short. Throughout Germanic lands, warden trees were planted at the center of farmsteads and villages, living connections to that great world tree at the heart of everything. People made offerings to these trees, whispered their hopes into the bark, and yes, knocked upon them when they needed the Norns to hear their prayers. As late as the 19th century, in certain regions of Germany and Scandinavia, these guardian trees were still venerated, still considered bringers of luck and protectors against misfortune. What the ancient peoples knew, without perhaps being able to articulate it in our modern way, was that trees were anchors. In a world of constant change, of seasons turning, of loved ones dying, of fortunes rising and falling like the tides, the great oaks and ashes stood firm. They had been there before any living person was born, and they would be there long after everyone who walked beneath them had returned to dust. To knock upon wood was to tap into that permanence, to borrow a little of that steadfastness, to ground oneself in something older and more stable than the shifting sands of human life, and perhaps that is why the practice persisted, even as the old religions faded and new faiths swept across Europe. Perhaps that is why, even today, we reach for wood when we speak of luck, not because we consciously believe in tree spirits, but because somewhere deep in our bones, we remember that trees were once our teachers, our protectors, our gods. The shadows lengthen now across the forest floor. The last light catches the topmost branches, and for a moment, just a moment, the leaves seem to whisper something we almost understand. When Christianity spread across Europe in the early centuries of the Common Era, it encountered peoples who had worshipped trees for time out of mind. The missionaries who carried the gospel into the forests of Germany, the hills of Ireland, the groves of Britain, faced a choice. They could try to stamp out every vestige of the old ways, or they could transform those ancient practices into something compatible with the new faith. They chose, as missionaries so often have, to do both, destroying the most obvious symbols of paganism while quietly absorbing the deeper currents of belief. The great oaks that had been sacred to the Druids were sometimes cut down with great ceremony, as when Saint Boniface felled Thor's oak at Geismar in the 8th century. But even as the trees fell, something curious happened to the tradition of touching wood for luck. It was not forgotten, it was reinterpreted. For what was the cross upon which Christ had died, if not wood? What was the instrument of salvation, the symbol of divine protection, if not a simple construction of timber? The practice of touching wood for protection, which had once invoked the spirits of sacred trees, became linked in the Christian imagination to the wood of the true cross, the actual beams upon which, according to tradition, Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified in Jerusalem. Pilgrims traveled from across Christendom to venerate fragments of the true cross, those precious relics that churches and cathedrals claim to possess. To touch such a relic was to touch the very instrument of salvation, to receive a blessing that flowed directly from Christ's sacrifice. And for those who could not make the pilgrimage, for the peasant in the field and the merchant in the market square, the simple act of touching wood, any wood, became a humble echo of that sacred contact. It is said that some Christians began carrying small pieces of wood with them, fragments they believed might connect them to the sacred timber of Calvary. When they spoke of their hopes or their fears, when fortune smiled upon them, or when they needed protection from ill luck, they would reach into their pockets and touch that bit of wood, invoking the protection of Christ through the material of his sacrifice. The precise historical connections between pagan tree veneration and Christian cross veneration are, like so much from those distant centuries, lost in the mists of time. No chronicle survives to tell us exactly when the first convert realized that touching wood could serve both the old gods and the new God. But the outcome is clear. The practice continued, crossing from one belief system to another, like a traveler passing between two countries, without ever quite leaving the road. In medieval England, an ancient wooden statue of a knight stood in Southwark Cathedral, its nose worn smooth and shiny from the touches of countless hands. Knights preparing for battle, merchants hoping for good fortune, ordinary folks seeking protection from the plague or the tax collector. All would pause before that wooden figure and touch its nose for luck. Was this Christian devotion a holdover from pagan times, or something that had become impossible to categorize? Perhaps it was all three at once. Meanwhile, far from the cathedrals and the standing stones, something quite different was happening in a world of shadows and fear. In the year 1492, a darkness fell across the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish Inquisition, under the notorious Tomás de Torquemada, was hunting for heresy with terrible efficiency, and among its primary targets were the Jews, the conversos who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of practicing their old faith in secret, and those who had not converted at all. There is a story told in whispers and written in memory of how Jewish communities in those desperate times developed secret systems of coded knocks to identify themselves at the wooden doors of hidden synagogues. When persecution made open worship impossible, when to be discovered practicing Judaism meant torture and death, those wooden doors became the thin barrier between life and annihilation. A special knock, 3 taps in a particular rhythm, or a pattern only the faithful would know, would gain a fugitive entry to a place of prayer and sanctuary. The wood of those synagogue doors, many say, became synonymous with safety, with survival, with the hope that one might live to see another day. To knock on wood was to knock on the door of refuge. How much of this story is historical fact, and how much is folkloric embroidery woven by later generations, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the story exists, that it has been passed down through Jewish communities for centuries, and that it speaks to a profound truth about the human relationship with wood, that in times of greatest danger, we have looked to simple timber for protection. The Yiddish phrase, kein ayin hara, meaning no evil eye, serves a similar protective purpose in Jewish tradition, warding off misfortune when one speaks of good luck. But knocking on wood has also found its place in Jewish homes around the world, a gesture that may carry echoes of those desperate knocks on synagogue doors, or may simply reflect the universal human desire to protect good fortune from jealous fate. There are other traditions too, that the Christian centuries absorbed without quite acknowledging. Sailors, those travelers of the most uncertain of elements, developed their own relationship with wood. The wooden decks and hulls of their ships were the only things standing between them and the hungry sea, and knocking on wood became, for many mariners, a ritual of appealing for safe passage. The ship itself became a kind of living entity, responsive to care and respect, and to knock upon its timbers was to communicate with the spirit of the vessel, asking it to carry its crew safely to port. Miners, too, descending into the dark earth where wooden beams held back the weight of the world, developed the habit of knocking on the timber supports that lined their tunnels. In part, this was practical. A hollow sound might indicate rotted wood, a support about to fail. But it was also something more, a way of acknowledging the thin margin between safety and catastrophe, of asking the wood to hold firm for just one more day. What emerges from this tapestry of traditions is a picture more complex than any single origin story can capture. Touching wood, knocking on wood, seeking protection from timber. These practices wove together Celtic tree spirits and Christian crosses. Jewish, survival, and maritime superstition, until the threads became inseparable. By the time we reach the 19th century, when folklorists first began writing down such customs in earnest, the origins had become thoroughly mixed, thoroughly argued over, thoroughly uncertain. But the practice itself remained as strong as ever, stronger perhaps, for having absorbed so many meanings, so many hopes, so many needs. The moon rises now over the cathedral spires, over the hidden synagogues, over the ships rocking at anchor in distant harbors. And somewhere, in all of these places, a hand reaches out in the darkness and knocks 3 times upon wood. In the schoolyards and village greens of 19th century Britain, children chased each other through summer afternoons in a game that had a curious name, Tiggy Touchwood. The rules were simple, as the best children's games always are. One child was it, the tagger, the pursuer, the seeker. The other children ran and scattered, trying to avoid being caught. But there was a way to escape, a way to become safe, untouchable, immune from capture. All you had to do was touch wood, a tree in the corner of the schoolyard, a wooden fence along the playing field, a door, a post, a railing. Any wood would do. The moment your fingers made contact with that wooden surface, you were safe. The tagger could not touch you. You had found sanctuary in the ancient material, refuge in the simplest of substances. The children probably did not know, as they squealed and ran, that they were enacting something very old. They did not pause to consider why wood, of all things, should offer protection. They simply played as children have always played, absorbing the rules without questioning them, passing the game from older children to younger ones in an endless chain of summer days. But folklorist Steve Roud, who spent years collecting the games and rhymes of British childhood, became convinced that this simple game held a key to understanding one of the most widespread superstitions in the world. In his book, The Law of the Playground, he traced the history of Tiggy Touchwood and its many variants. Tiggy, Tiggy, Touchwood, Tig Touchwood, Touchwood I'm free, and proposed something that scandalized traditionalists and delighted skeptics. The superstition of touching wood, he argued, did not descend from ancient Celtic tree spirits or medieval Christian crosses. It came from here, from this game, from children running in the sun. Adults, seeing children become safe by touching wood, absorbed the association into their own thinking. The language of the game, touchwood, became the language of a superstition. It is almost certainly the origin of our modern superstitious practice of saying touchwood. Roud wrote with the confidence of a man who had spent decades in the archives. The claim that the latter goes back to when we believed in tree spirits is complete nonsense. Not everyone agrees, of course. How could they? Such a prosaic explanation for such a widespread practice seems to many inadequate to the task. Surely there must be something deeper, something more profound, something that reaches back beyond the Victorian schoolyard to the mists of prehistory. And indeed, the scholars who study such things remain divided. Some point out that children's games often preserve ancient customs rather than create new ones. That Tiggy Touchwood might itself be a survival of older beliefs, enacted in play without conscious understanding. Others note that the phrase touchwood appears in print only in the late 19th century, suggesting that if the superstition were truly ancient, we should expect to find earlier references. The Oxford English Dictionary traces the expression back to an 1898 reference, which describes the game as the likely source. Yet absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the gap between oral tradition and written record has swallowed many truths. What seems beyond dispute is that by the end of the Victorian era, touching wood had become thoroughly established as a superstitious practice among adults throughout Britain, and increasingly throughout the English-speaking world. The phrase touch wood was spoken in drawing rooms and kitchens, in public houses and gentlemen's clubs. It crossed the Atlantic with emigrants and took root in American soil, where knock on wood gradually replaced its British cousin as the preferred phrase. Perhaps what matters most is not where the superstition came from, but what it reveals about human nature. Children, in their innocent play, created safe zones, places where the rules of the chase were suspended, where the hunted could rest and the hunter could not follow. They chose wood for these sanctuaries, perhaps because wood was everywhere in their world, perhaps for reasons even they could not articulate. And adults watching found in this play an echo of their own deeper needs. For are we not all, in some sense, running from something? Are we not all seeking moments of safety, places where misfortune cannot touch us, sanctuaries from the chase of fate? The child who touches the oak tree and shouts, "I'm safe," is doing exactly what the adult does when they knock on a table and say touch wood, reaching for protection, hoping for a moment's respite from vulnerability. In the centuries since Tiggy Touchwood became knock on wood, the practice has spread far beyond the English-speaking world. In France, they say touche du bois. In Spain, toca madera. In Germany, auf Holzklopfen. In Brazil, 3 knocks are required, and the wood must be solid and real, no substitutes allowed. The phrases differ, but the gesture remains remarkably consistent. A hand reaching for wood, knuckles rapping gently, hope expressed in the most ancient of materials. Consider the variations, each carrying its own regional flavor. In Denmark, the tradition requires knocking 3 times under a wooden table while reciting the numbers 7, 9, and 13. Numbers that have their own magical significance in Scandinavian folklore. In Sweden, people say pepper, pepper, tar, I tra, pepper, pepper, touchwood, combining the protective gesture with the throwing of pepper over one's shoulder, a doubling of defenses against ill luck. In Latin America, a curious prohibition has developed. The wood must be without legs. Tocar madera sin patas, they say. Touch wood without legs. This means that tables, chairs, and beds are excluded from the protection. The superstition has developed its own internal logic, its own rules for what counts and what does not. Whether this prohibition emerged from some older tradition or developed organically as the practice spread, no one can say for certain. In Turkey, the gesture has been elaborated further. When one knocks on wood to ward off bad luck, a practice called tahtaya vurmak. One first pulls gently on one's earlobe, then knocks on wood twice in quick succession. The whole ritual is accompanied by phrases invoking divine protection. Allah korusun, God forbid, or nazar değmesin, may the evil eye not touch. Here, knocking on wood has merged with the ancient fear of the evil eye, that malevolent glance that can steal happiness and bring misfortune. In Iran, where the fear of the evil eye runs particularly deep, people knock on wood while saying, Bezan am bitakte, cheshm nakore. I am knocking on wood to prevent being jinxed. The gesture and the phrase work together, sound and action combining to create a protective spell against forces that might overhear one's good fortune and decide to take it away. The Italians, characteristically, have chosen a different material entirely. Rather than touching wood, they say tocca ferro, touch iron. The gesture is performed especially when one sees an undertaker or something associated with death, and it reflects a different protective tradition, perhaps connected to the iron horseshoes that have long been considered lucky throughout Europe. Yet the underlying impulse is the same: to reach for a material that can protect, to make contact with something that stands between oneself and harm. In all of these variations, what strikes the observer is not the differences, but the similarities. Across languages and cultures, across continents and centuries, human beings have developed remarkably similar rituals for protecting good fortune and warding off bad. The materials may vary: wood here, iron there. The gesture may be a knock or a touch or a tap, but the underlying belief remains constant, that by making contact with certain substances, by performing certain actions, we can influence the forces that govern luck and fate. The old ones would not be surprised. They knew long before psychology had a name that human beings need rituals to manage uncertainty. And the children of Tiggy Touchwood knew it too, even if they could not have said so. Safe, they cried, touching the tree. Home free. The year was 2013, when a research team at the University of Chicago set out to study something that most scientists would consider unworthy of serious investigation: superstition. Led by psychologist Jane Risen, the researchers wanted to know whether superstitious rituals like knocking on wood actually did anything, not in the mystical sense of influencing cosmic forces, but in the psychological sense of affecting how people thought and felt about their luck. What they discovered was both fascinating and, to many, unexpected. The researchers brought participants into their laboratory and asked them to do something uncomfortable, to tempt fate. Say something like this, they instructed: "No one I know will ever get into a car accident," or "I've never broken a bone in my life," or "I'm not worried about failing this test." These were exactly the kinds of statements that, in everyday life, make us reach instinctively for wood. They are boasts or hopes or confident predictions that seem to invite misfortune simply by being spoken. Then the researchers divided the participants into groups. Some were asked to knock on wood after making their fate-tempting statements. Others were asked to throw a ball away from their bodies. Still others simply held on to the ball and did nothing. Then all the participants were asked how likely they thought the bad outcome, the car accident, the broken bone, the failed test, was to occur. The results were striking. Those who had knocked on wood believed the negative outcome was significantly less likely than those who had done nothing. But here was the truly interesting part. Those who had thrown the ball away from their bodies showed the same reduction in perceived risk as those who had knocked on wood, even though throwing a ball has no superstitious connotation whatsoever. What the researchers concluded was that the power of knocking on wood lies not in the wood itself, but in the direction of the movement. Any action that pushes something away from the body, that creates a sense of distancing or avoidance, helps to reduce the anxiety generated by tempting fate. Knocking on wood is effective not because of ancient tree spirits or the wood of the cross, but because the act of knocking moves something away from oneself. The research team called this the avoidant action hypothesis. They found that when people engage in an avoidant action after tempting fate, they have a less vivid mental image of the feared negative event. The action doesn't change reality. Cars still crash, bones still break, tests are still failed. But it changes something in the mind. It creates a sense that the bad luck has been pushed away, deflected, handled. After a jinx, avoidant actions, even those that are not part of a superstitious belief system, effectively undo the effect of the jinx, the researchers wrote. The gesture works by giving people a sense that they have done something, that they have not merely spoken tempting words into an indifferent universe, but have taken action to protect themselves. This may explain why so many superstitious gestures across cultures involve pushing something away, throwing salt over your shoulder, spitting to ward off the evil eye, knocking wood in a direction away from your body. All of these create the same psychological effect, a sense of separation between oneself and the anticipated misfortune. But there is something more here, something that the research touched upon without fully exploring. The practice of knocking on wood persists, even among people who do not believe in it. And this is perhaps the most mysterious finding of all. Other researchers have studied what they call acquiescence to superstition. Psychologist Julie Risen, no relation to the Jane Risen of the knocking on wood study, has examined why intelligent, rational people continue to engage in superstitious behaviors even when they know consciously and explicitly that such behaviors cannot possibly work. What she found is that superstitious thinking is what psychologists call a cognitive default. Our brains are wired to make intuitive leaps, to see patterns, to feel that actions and outcomes are connected, even when logic tells us otherwise. And when our intuition says that we should knock on wood, when that quick, automatic system in our minds fires off a warning that we have tempted fate, most people simply go along with it. They hedge their bets. They knock, just in case. This is not stupidity, Risen argues, but a kind of mental efficiency. Our intuitive system is faster and more powerful than our rational system, and it takes considerable effort to override it. Most of the time, the stakes of knocking on wood are so low, a brief tap on a table, a muttered phrase, that there is no reason to fight our intuitions. The cost of the superstition is near zero. The comfort it provides is real. There is another dimension to all of this, one that researchers have only begun to explore: the social function of superstition. When you knock on wood in the presence of others, you are communicating something. You are saying, "I am aware that I have spoken boldly. I do not wish to seem arrogant. I acknowledge the uncertainty of life. I hope for the best, but prepare for the worst." This social signaling may be as important as any psychological effect. In many cultures, to speak confidently of good fortune without some protective gesture is considered arrogant, tempting fate in a way that offends both gods and neighbors. The knock on wood is a form of ritual humility, a way of softening a boast, of showing that one has not forgotten one's place in the order of things. Studies have found that superstitious behaviors are most common in situations of high uncertainty and stress. Professional athletes who face intense pressure and unpredictable outcomes are particularly prone to elaborate pre-game rituals and lucky charms. Actors preparing for auditions, students sitting for exams, entrepreneurs launching businesses, all show elevated rates of superstitious behavior. when we feel most out of control, we reach for whatever tools might help us feel in control again. And for millions of people, one of those tools is the simple act of knocking on wood. But perhaps the most remarkable finding of all is how the practice has persisted despite, or maybe because of, our age of reason. One might have expected that as education spread, as science explained more and more of the world, superstitions like knocking on wood would fade away. The opposite has happened. Surveys suggest that the practice is as common today as it ever was, perhaps more common, as global communication has spread the phrase and the gesture to corners of the world that might never have encountered it otherwise. People continue to knock on wood not despite knowing it cannot work, but because they are not entirely sure that it cannot, or perhaps because they are not willing to take the chance, or perhaps because the act itself, regardless of any supernatural effect, provides something real and valuable, a moment's pause, a breath of humility, a ritual acknowledgement that fortune is fickle and that we are not masters of our fate. The laboratories may have measured the psychological effects of knocking on wood, but they have not dispelled the mystery. For in the end, the question is not whether the gesture changes external reality. It almost certainly does not, but whether it changes something in ourselves. And on that question, the ancient peoples and the modern researchers seem, unexpectedly, to agree. In Cairo, when a mother speaks of her child's good health, she might say, "Imsek el-khashab," "Emsek el-khashab," hold the wood. She does not knock. She holds, gripping the wood firmly as if to anchor her blessing to something solid, something that cannot be taken away by envious spirits or the malevolent eye of jealous neighbors. In Egypt, as in so much of the Middle East, the fear of envy is ever present, and the gesture of holding wood serves as a shield against those invisible forces that might snatch happiness from the deserving. In Tehran, the tradition runs even deeper. When something wonderful happens, when good news arrives, when fortune smiles, Iranians reach for wood and speak the phrase "Bezan ambe takhte, cheshm nakore." I am knocking on wood to prevent being jinxed. The evil eye, or cheshm zakhm, is taken seriously here, a malevolent force that operates through envy and admiration alike. Even a compliment can be dangerous, for it draws attention to one's blessings, and attention can bring the eye upon you. Wood, solid and natural and unpretentious, offers protection. Travel west to the Mediterranean, and the tradition shifts slightly, but remains recognizable. In Spain, they say toca madera, touching wood just as their British and American cousins do. In France, toucher du bois carries the same meaning, spoken in drawing rooms and farmhouses alike. But cross the Strait of Gibraltar to Morocco, or sail across to Italy, and you may find that wood is not the only protective material. The Italians, those masters of gesture and superstition, favor iron. Tocca ferro, they say, touch iron, particularly when the subject turns to death or when an undertaker passes by. Perhaps this preference reflects the ancient Roman reverence for iron, that metal of Mars, god of war and protection. Or perhaps it connects to the horseshoe, that lucky charm that has hung over doorways for centuries. In either case, the principle remains. Some materials hold power, and touching them can transfer that power to the one who reaches out. In Russia and Ukraine, the tradition of knocking on wood persists. Postuchat poderevu, but it is often accompanied by another gesture, a triple spitting sound, tfu, 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 made over the left shoulder. The left side, in many traditions, is the side of instability, of darkness, of forces that wish us harm. Spitting over that shoulder is thought to blind the evil spirits lurking there, to confuse them and send them away. Combined with the knock on wood, it creates a double layer of protection. In Turkey, the ritual has evolved into an elaborate performance. When good fortune is mentioned, the Turk will first tug gently at one earlobe, a gesture said to derive from the tradition of pulling the ear of those who speak too proudly, and then knock twice on wood while saying, Nazar değmesin, may the evil eye not touch. Some add mashallah, a phrase meaning God has willed it, an acknowledgement that all good things come from divine blessing and not from human merit. In Bulgaria, the knock on wood serves specifically to ward off evil rather than to attract good luck. The Bulgarian phrase chukam nadavo comes with its own requirements. One knocks, then lightly pulls one's earlobe with the same hand, sealing the protective gesture. Common accompaniments include Bog dani padzi, God guard us, or the even more direct Danechue Javalat, may the devil not hear. Consider the Czech Republic, where the tradition has developed its own distinctive character. Before knocking on wood, one says, Musim to zaklepat, I have to knock it down. But here, wood is not the only acceptable material. One may knock on glass, on metal, or even, in a twist that might amuse the ancients, on one's own teeth or forehead. The forehead, after all, is made of bone, which is at least as solid as wood, and the teeth are harder still. The principle of seeking protection from solid material has been generalized beyond any specific substance. In Denmark, an entirely different tradition has taken root. When Danes wish to ward off bad luck, they knock 3 times under a wooden table while saying the numbers 7, 9, and 13. These numbers have their own mystical significance in Scandinavian tradition, carrying meanings that reach back to the pre-Christian era. 7 and 9 appear throughout Norse mythology as sacred counts. 13, though unlucky in much of Europe, takes on protective power when spoken in this ritual context. The Swedes add yet another element. Pepper, pepper, pepper. Ta I tre. Pepper, pepper, touchwood, they say. Sometimes actually throwing pepper over their shoulders before reaching for the nearest wooden surface. Whether the pepper comes from a tradition of its own or has been borrowed from other protective customs, it has become inseparable from the Swedish version of knocking on wood. In Latin America, the tradition of tocar madera carries a fascinating prohibition. The wood must be sin patas, without legs. This means that tables, chairs, and beds are excluded from the protective gesture. One must find a door, a wall, a windowsill, something that is not a piece of furniture. Some say this rule developed because furniture carries too much human association, too much of the everyday. The wood must be closer to its natural state to hold power. Others suggest more practical origins, that knocking on tables and chairs was considered rude, and the prohibition evolved to enforce manners while maintaining the superstition. In Argentina, the tradition takes an even more surprising turn. Men, when needing to ward off bad luck, may tap their left testicle rather than knocking on wood. Women grab their left breast. These gestures connect to an entirely different tradition of protective magic, one focused on fertility and the continuation of life, yet they are performed in the same context where wood knocking would occur elsewhere. The principle of seeking bodily or material protection against fate remains constant, even as the specific gesture varies. And in Indonesia, when someone says something ominous or unlucky, the proper response is to knock on wood and then knock on one's own forehead, declaring amit-amit, a phrase meaning roughly reject, reject. The double knock creates a double barrier. The wood blocks the misfortune from entering the physical world, and the forehead blocks it from entering the mind. What emerges from this global survey is not a single tradition that spread from one source, but a universal human impulse expressed in local forms. Everywhere, people face uncertainty. Everywhere, they speak of their hopes and fears. And everywhere, they reach for something solid, something ancient, something that might protect them from the capricious turning of fortune's wheel. Perhaps the trees did hold spirits, once upon a time. Perhaps the wood of the cross does carry divine protection. Perhaps the children of Tiki Touchwood stumbled upon something that was always waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and more profound, that human beings need rituals, need gestures, need physical acts that give form to our hopes and fears. And wood, that most ancient and abundant of materials, has offered itself as the canvas for our universal longing for safety. The wind stirs the branches outside. Somewhere in Cairo, a mother holds fast to wood. Somewhere in Istanbul, a merchant tugs his ear and knocks twice. Somewhere in São Paulo, a child searches for wood without legs. And somewhere in every human heart, the same small prayer rises. Let this good fortune hold. Let this blessing last. There is a desk before you, perhaps, or a table, or a door frame. There is wood within reach, as there almost always is, because we have built our world from the bodies of trees. And somewhere in you, whether you notice it or not, there is an awareness of that wood, a knowledge inherited from sources too numerous to count, that this material is more than material. You will speak someday soon of something you hope for. You will mention your health, perhaps, or your job, or someone you love. You will say, so far, so good, or I've been lucky, or nothing has gone wrong yet. And in that moment of speaking, something will shift in the air around you. You will feel, perhaps just faintly, that you have said too much, revealed too much, tempted something that should not be tempted. And your hand will move. It will move without conscious decision, without philosophical contemplation, without any clear sense of why. Your knuckles will rap against wood, once, twice, 3 times, and something in you will settle. The anxiety you did not quite admit to feeling will ease its grip. The words you spoke will feel somehow safer, somehow sealed, somehow protected by that small percussion. You will have joined a company that stretches back beyond memory. The mother in ancient Ireland, touching the oak beside her doorway as she speaks of her children's safety. The Jewish fugitive in 15th century Spain, knocking the secret pattern that will admit him to sanctuary. The Victorian child, hand-slapping tree trunk as she shouts, I'm safe. The sailor on the wooden deck, the miner in the timber-shored tunnel, the night before the statue in Southwark Cathedral, the researcher in the Chicago laboratory, discovering what all of them already knew. Something works, not in the way the skeptic fears, not by bending physics or commanding fate, but in the way the human heart requires. The knock on wood creates a moment of pause, a gesture of humility, a physical expression of the universal truth that we do not control our destinies. It acknowledges what the ancient peoples never forgot and what the modern world sometimes pretends to have transcended, that life is uncertain, that good fortune is a gift that can be withdrawn, that pride invites its own fall. The psychologists have measured this, and their measurements confirm what the tradition always taught. People who knock on wood feel less anxious. They have less vivid mental images of feared outcomes. They experience a sense of having done something, of having taken action in a world that often leaves us helpless. The gesture works because it changes something in the one who makes it. But perhaps there is more to it than psychology alone can capture. Perhaps the millions of knocks that have echoed through human history have left something behind, a kind of communal reassurance, a shared ritual that binds us to all who have knocked before. When you tap your knuckles on wood, you are doing what your grandmother did, and her grandmother, and her grandmother's grandmother. Back through centuries of hoping and fearing and reaching for protection. You are participating in one of humanity's oldest continuous traditions. Not a religion, not a philosophy, but something more basic, a gesture of recognition that we are small in the face of vast forces we cannot see or control. The knock on wood is a prayer without words, a communion without doctrine, a shared humanity expressed through the simplest of actions. And the wood receives it. That is perhaps the strangest part of all, that wood, dead and cut and fashioned into furniture and doors and tables, still feels like something that can receive. We do not knock on plastic, not really, not with the same sense of rightness. We do not knock on metal, unless we are Italian and know the tradition of toccaferro. Something about wood itself, its origin in living trees, its grain that records years of growth, its warmth under the hand, makes it feel like an appropriate recipient of our small ritual. The trees from which this wood came were once alive, as the ancients knew. They drew water from the earth and light from the sky, and turned these elements into their own substance. They stood through storms and droughts, through harsh winters and blistering summers, growing ring by ring toward heights we could not reach. When they fell, whether by age or axe or lightning, something of that life remained in their substance, waiting in the grain for human hands to acknowledge it. Perhaps that is why we knock on wood and not on stone. Stone is too old, too cold, too far removed from the cycle of growth and death that governs our lives. Wood remembers what it was to be alive. Wood knows what it is to grow, to endure, to fall, and yet to remain. And we, who grow and endure and will one day fall, recognize something of ourselves in the material that receives our knock. The great oaks still stand in some places, guardians of groves that have survived the centuries. The ash trees still reach toward the sky, echoes of Yggdrasil, reminders of the cosmic tree that holds all worlds together. And every wooden desk, every banister, every door and table and chair carries within it a thread of connection to those ancient sacred trees. There are those who say that superstition is the province of the ignorant, that educated people should know better than to knock on wood or throw salt over their shoulders or avoid walking under ladders. Perhaps they are right, in some narrow technical sense. Perhaps the universe is indeed indifferent to our knocks and our salt and our careful avoidance of ladders. But perhaps there is a wisdom in superstition that transcends the question of whether it works in any literal way. Perhaps the rituals we perform, the small gestures we make, serve purposes that have nothing to do with influencing external events. They connect us to our ancestors. They give form to our hopes and fears. They create moments of mindfulness in lives that move too fast for contemplation. They remind us that certainty is an illusion and humility is a virtue. The next time you speak of something you hope for, pay attention to what your hand does. Watch as it moves, almost of its own accord, toward the nearest wooden surface. Feel the grain beneath your knuckles. Hear the hollow sound as you knock, once, twice, 3 times, and know that in that moment you are not alone. You are joined by countless others, living and dead, who have made the same gesture for the same reasons. You are part of something larger than yourself, a tradition that spans cultures and centuries, a universal human practice that says, in every language and in every land, I am aware of my good fortune. I do not take it for granted. I hope it continues. The evening has grown deep around us now. The fire burns low, and the shadows have gathered close. Outside, the wind moves through the trees, carrying whispers we cannot quite hear, messages from a time when humans and trees were close akin. What do the trees know that we have forgotten? What did the ancients understand that we have lost in our bright electric age? Perhaps nothing that can be measured or proven or reduced to data. Perhaps only this, that the world is mysterious, that fortune is fragile, that wood has witnessed more than we can imagine, and that sometimes the simplest gesture carries the weight of 1,000 years. Knock, knock, knock. The sound is small, but the silence that follows is very, very deep. And somewhere in that silence, something ancient stirs and listens and, perhaps, just perhaps, responds. We have walked together through forests both ancient and imagined, through cathedrals and schoolyards, through laboratories and distant lands where hands reach for wood in 100 different languages. We have heard the theories of scholars and the testimonies of believers, the skeptics and the faithful, the scientists with their measurements, and the grandmothers with their knowing looks. And yet the mystery remains. Not the mystery of origin, though that too remains unsolved, hidden in the lost centuries before anyone thought to write such things down. But a deeper mystery, one that all the theories and all the evidence cannot quite dispel. Why does this particular gesture, this simple knock upon wood, feel so right? There are superstitions that seem silly even to those who practice them. There are rituals that embarrass us, that we perform in private and deny in public, that we would not explain to strangers. But knocking on wood is different. People knock openly, unashamedly, in offices and restaurants and airports. Executives knock on their mahogany desks. Travelers knock on airport benches. Surgeons knock on wooden door frames before entering operating theaters. The gesture has survived the death of the beliefs that supposedly gave it birth. The tree spirits have faded from common consciousness. Few people today consciously connect their knock to the wood of Christ's cross, or to secret synagogue doors, or to a Victorian children's game. And yet they knock. They knock because something in the gesture speaks to something in their nature that transcends any particular explanation. Perhaps what the wood remembers is simply this, that human beings need to believe they can do something, anything, in the face of uncertainty. We cannot control the future. We cannot guarantee our safety or our happiness or the well-being of those we love. But we can knock, and in that knock, we can participate in a tradition that tells us we are not alone in our hoping and fearing, that millions before us have faced the same uncertainties and reached for the same ancient remedy. The knock on wood is not magic. It does not bend the laws of physics or compel the universe to favor us, but it bends something in ourselves, something perhaps more important. It bends our anxiety into action, our fear into gesture, our isolation into communion with all who have knocked before. And in that bending, something eases, something settles, something finds, if only for a moment, a kind of peace. Outside, the first stars are appearing in the darkening sky. The trees stand in silhouette against the fading light, and their branches move in the evening wind like the fingers of old friends waving goodbye. In houses and apartments across the world, people are speaking of their hopes, their plans, their fragile good fortunes. And as they speak, their hands are moving, reaching, finding wood. Knock, knock, knock. The sound rises into the night air and mingles with all the knocks that have come before. A percussion stretching back through centuries, a rhythm as old as human hope. And somewhere, in some way we cannot name and will never fully understand, the wood is listening. It has always been listening. Some say the trees remember. Some say the wood itself holds echoes of the hands that have touched it, the hopes that have been whispered to it, the fears that have been confided to its grain. Some say that every piece of wood, from the mightiest beam to the humblest chopstick, carries within it a trace of the great world tree that stands at the center of everything, that holds the universe together, that bridges the worlds of gods and humans and the dead. These are beliefs, not facts. They cannot be proven in any laboratory or measured by any instrument. But they persist, as they have always persisted, because they speak to something in us that needs to be spoken to. They tell us that we are not alone, that the material world is not merely dead matter, but something alive with meaning, that our small gestures of hope are received and perhaps even answered. And so we knock. We knock when we speak of health and happiness. We knock when we boast and when we worry. We knock when fortune smiles and when we fear that smile might fade. We knock in 1,000 languages, in 1,000,000 homes, in every corner of the world where human beings have built their lives from the bodies of trees. Touch wood, we say. Knock on wood. And the wood, ancient and patient and wise beyond our understanding, receives the knock and holds it and keeps it safe among all the other knocks that have been offered since the first human hand reached for the first sacred tree, seeking something that might last, something that might protect, something that might help. The night has come fully now. The fire has burned to embers, and the room is warm with their glow. It is time to rest, to let the story settle, to let the mystery remain what it has always been, a mystery, gentle and persistent, as old as wood itself. Sleep well, and when you wake, and when you speak of your hopes, remember the trees, remember the groves, remember the children playing their ancient game, remember the scholars and the sailors and the saints and the seekers, all reaching for the same material, all making the same gesture, all hoping for the same impossible thing, that good fortune might last, that blessing might endure, that the fragile gift of happiness might be preserved by a simple knock upon wood. Touch wood, and may it hear you. She remembers her own grandmother, who came from the old country with nothing but a bundle of clothes and a few words of blessing. That grandmother touched the wooden door frame of her new home in New York or Boston or Chicago and whispered something in a language her granddaughter never learned. Something about protection, something about hope, something about the wood remembering. And she remembers her mother, who knocked on the kitchen table every time she spoke of her children's futures, who knocked before job interviews and doctor's appointments and wedding days, who knocked without thinking, without explaining, without ever questioning why the gesture mattered. It simply did. Now the grandmother sits in her own kitchen, in a house built partly of wood and partly of materials that did not exist when her grandmother was born. The countertops are granite, the floors are laminate, the appliances are steel and plastic and glass, but the door frames are still wood, and the windowsills and the old oak table that has traveled from house to house through 3 generations of the family. Her granddaughter visits, a young woman of the digital age, who carries in her pocket a device that holds more information than all the libraries of ancient Alexandria. The young woman speaks of her new job, of her hopes, of things going well. "Touch wood," the grandmother says, and her hand moves to the old oak table. The granddaughter smiles. She does not quite believe in such things. She is a child of science, of reason, of the bright modern world. But she watches her grandmother's hand, gnarled with age and soft with a lifetime of love, as it rests upon the wood. And something in her responds. She reaches out too. Her young hand joins her grandmother's on the old oak surface. Their knuckles touch the grain together. Knock, knock, knock. The sound is small in the quiet kitchen, but it carries across the generations, across the oceans, across the centuries. It joins all the other knocks that have been and will be, a percussion of hope, a rhythm of humanity, a simple gesture that says, we are still here, we are still hoping, we are still reaching for something that might protect us. The grandmother smiles, the granddaughter smiles, and somewhere, in the grain of the old oak table, in the rings that recorded years of sun and rain and growth, something that might be memory stirs, something that might be listening, something that has been waiting, patiently, for the knock. Touch wood. The gesture survives. The tradition continues. And as long as there is wood in the world, and as long as there are human beings who hope and fear and reach for protection, the knock will go on. Knock, knock, knock. Forever.